Thank you very much. Thank you too. Thanks.
You have to use it. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity in particular, and thanks for the organization of this chance. Thank you very much.
Because they are not going to see you.
Yeah. So I guess this way.
You can just this one if you want.
Don't worry. I guess it's gonna be the same. All right. All right. Thank you very much. Well, first things first. Let's start with the concept of digital identity. The identity of the individual, firstly, has been one of the most discussed topics in the legal field, but from the jurisprudence and from the authors. In particular, while in the past analysis of the individual only as the right to a name was expressed in a purely statistic and identifying way, substantially appreciating itself in a vision of the individual unable to change in the course of life, in recent years the perspective appears radically reversed, becoming increasingly, becoming increasingly important to identify as a mobile concept of the subject within the legal system, on the basis of the will and freedom of the individual and in him and his self-determination. In fact, starting from the protection to the right of name, in a statistic and identifying sense, the right to identity imposes a respect from society to how the individual sees himself. In order to settle the relationship between the right to identity and the right to a name, these are the main differences. The right to the name and the right to identity, first of all, are not the same. To be more specific, the right to identity, while not necessarily being considered superior or largely to the right of the name being able the last to find protection where the second has none, the first to find protection where the second has none, without any doubt, has features that distinguish it with greater breadth, allowing a protection of the subject also linked to new cases, and not necessarily predetermined. It should be noted that the latter difference, on the other hand, greatly restricted the possibility of protecting the right to a name. Lastly, the right to identity in recent years has met an increasing number of challenges brought by the development of technology. The protection of the subject, in fact, must embrace the aspects related to the digital identity. Moreover, it's not possible to remain silent about the fact that today's identity is being increasingly tested in contemporary society by virtue of the speed and scale of the changes it faces. It is also important to question the extent to which considerations which have alternated over time in the past on physical and digital identity can be applied. The relationship between the two aspects is in fact a central point in overcoming the static conception of the individual in favor of a more dynamic conception that digital identity brought to us. The identity in particular is not limited to the possibility granted by the legal system to be recognized its distinctive character, as the oldest perspective suggested, but notes with respect to the entire individual sphere of the subject, to which more and more the identity perspective guarantees, as a faculty of self-determination, comprehensively understanding, aimed to touch all the aspects that characterize it. In fact, it seems possible to understand which logical synthesis can be applied to another evolution, the right to identity in its digital sense, and I would like also to say in a digital context, characterized by a speed of change incomparably higher than that which affected the right to the name and the right to personal identity to occur. From the right to the name has thus developed also the right to the identity, and in the analysis of the relationship between the two have emerged two theses under a legal point of view. Firstly, a part of the authors pointing out that it could not in fact be considered a subjective right, therefore being able to the injured individual to be limited to obtain protection in the sense of having the right to terminate the injurious event recognized. For another point of view, another thesis has otherwise espoused the opposite orientation, moreover configuring the right to identity as an inviolable right of the person. The latter opinion nowadays is majority. All this being said, the right to digital identity has been defined as the interest that arises in relation to the right to be legitimately attributed the complex of elements that constitute the synthesis of personality in a digital sense, with, of course, the relative risks in terms of separation between subsidiaries. This, in this sense, think in this sense of the many digital threats that the subject, both in an individual sense and its collective manifestation, may encounter. For example, we know the so-called echo chambers, which prevent the intertwining of different points of view and risk strengthening the phenomenon of the so-called fake news, as well as the management of people's personal data, in some cases difficult to protect, especially when it happens in international context, where the largest and most powerful companies have a way to move very quickly between one jurisdiction and another. I'd like to say not just have their own way to move from a jurisdiction to another. However, in a view of increasingly changing in the dynamic of the individual, identity in the digital sense could only be born over time, as clarified on the point by the best authors. This differs significantly from its non-digital or analogic connotation, also for its consistent ability to mutate over time. Nevertheless, such a strong characterization of the identity in the digital sense has now become meaningful in everyday life, considering, among other things, the question of the so-called transaction identity, normally defined as that side of the identity or digital identity linked to the activity of purchasing goods and services on the web, and that constitutes only a part of the multiple phases of the identity of the individual. About these topics, particularly important, at least in my opinion, was the protection of the individual in the digital realm, for example, according to the right to be forgotten. In this sense, as recently established by the European Court of Justice, with the pronunciation of 2017 507, this right could only be protected in the European context and not abroad. On the other hand, it will be noted that it is essential once again to regulate the issues of digital reality, to set the reasoning starting from the individual. It is only by starting from the need to protect person and his identity that we can overcome the problem of the lack of territoriality of the network, in which the individual becomes an element of incardination, thus allowing the European Union to protect its citizens regardless of the occasional geographical location of this, as the GDPR clarifies. So after this brief introduction about the digital identity and the consideration of the user in the digital context, I'd like to talk to something about a little bit more specific, like the contractual relationship with the social network. We could consider, in fact, this kind of relationship as an example of the digital identity in its structural context. Therefore, analyzing the relationship between user and social, even in the list of fundamental rights, through an extensive interpretation of the right to the free manifestation of thought, it does not seem possible to avoid the fact that digital identity, for a substantial part of its material manifestation, becomes concrete within the reality of social networks. This is not only in terms of time. Much of the time spent on the internet is dedicated to these platforms, in fact, but also because of the nature of the activity that takes place in them. If in the past, when these digital platforms saw the light, they represented little more than a ludic time, today they are places where there are sources of information, channels of discussion, activities, and commerce. On the latter point, it is also of interest that individuals not only use the service offered, but also promote activities themselves, even with advertising or promotional functions. So it appears hard to draw a boundary line, understanding from which moment the subject changes from user consumer to promoter of a service, or again, what responsibility has the entity that manages a page within a social network regarding personal data, for example. These themes are concrete examples of the changes brought about by the development of digital identity, but emphasis should also be placed on the particular speed and pervasiveness of this, that differ not a little from the slowness of the overcoming of the dichotomy between right to the name and the identity that, as we know, has taken much more longer. Not only that, the relationship between user and social, constituting this one of the most important cases of radical declination of the digital identity of the individual, involves a series of questions. First of all, how to qualify the legal relationship that develops between user and social, or digital platforms in general, for a fee or free. It was not without complexity that the analysis turned out to be particularly hard to make over the nature of the agreement between the platform and the users. In particular, despite the many contractual forms examined, from the network contract to the contract of the administration, or even to an associative relationship. For part of the authors, the difference between the two activities exercised by the social platform and the internet services providers seems to be the main element in order to consider a difference between the contract to access the web and the contract by which the user is allowed to register and use the platforms, for example, a social platform. For other authors, on the other hand, the very nature of the service offered, as mentioned, intrinsically different from that of mere access to the internet, is an element to consider the gratuitousness of the contract in questions. The platform, in fact, according to this theory at least, would be limited to providing a virtual space dotted with advertisement, and only from the latter would receive a fee of an economic nature. The total discretion of the user in the use of the platform, therefore, would be offset by the elementary obligation of use aimed at allowing the operator of the platform the smooth performance of the same, thus avoiding that the latter might incur in any responsibility. The operator, long story short, could not be considered obliged to any behavior or guarantees inherent in the operation of the platform, nor to respect a minimum duration of services. This, ultimately, is made available as is, not constituting a synalagmatic service report. Not only that, within this detailed reconstruction is presented the thesis of the mere relationship of courtesies, considering the absence of a direct financial sacrifice of the users for the use of the service. However, it seems that this reconstruction is not acceptable, since even if we do not want to recognize the nature of synalagmacity to the relationship between social platform and user, it seems questionable that the platform gain from the presence of users, even indirectly thanks to advertising. For this reason, it seems that we can disregard this opinion, since the presence of users seems an undoubted necessity, because advertising notices are obviously intended for users themselves. To this reasoning stands, in fact, the objection of those who see elements of consideration in the relationship due to the economic purpose persuaded by the operator, both in the sale of advertising space and in the activity of user profiling. However, it was objected that the advertising activity constitutes a contractual relationship with the buyer of the promotional advertisement, and that the profiling activity would be merely incidental, being aimed at the use of the service for the benefit of the user, rather than the actual purchase of data. On the contrary, the lack of real exchange between manager and users, according to what the largest part of the authors is currently saying, is precisely based on the multitude of horizontal relationships between users, which would draw the maximum benefit in the use of social from such intersections, because there is no legally relevant interest between them and the operator, according to this theory. Similarly, the advertising activity and the possibility of drawing from it the necessary profits for the operator would always be in the interest of the users free to be able to use the platform itself free of charge, lacking an onerous relationship between those. I don't know how many times do we have left?
50 minutes.
All right, so I could do it. The user, in fact, at the time of registration wishes, and according to the general terms and condition of contract, accepts, to obtain access to relate to the platform as to obtain a plurality of connection related to its interest, and normally responding to its interaction within the platform itself, rather than being tied to an associative purpose that, according to this reconstruction, should be considered common to all members. In any case, the question of whether the legal relationship is free or not is the important one. The differences are relevant, in particular with respect to the greater or lesser responsibility of the digital platform, but not only that. In fact, recognizing the onerous nature of the relationship between user and social, for example, or for any other different internet platforms, has allowed to focus the investigation on a further issue, that of the marketing of the digital identity of the subject and the possible economic value of this. An economic consideration of identity, even if only partially, while not being in abstract incompatible with its ontological nature, requires the need to dwell on the questions that arise from this understanding, in particular, with respect to the extent to which the subject may have access to the fragments of the identity itself, for example, with regard to personal data. Thus, it becomes evident that the importance that in reasoning the question of the nature of the relationship, whether onerous or free, between user and digital platforms, when the former makes its data available in favor of the latter. Nevertheless, this last perspective seems to be effectively reconciled with the outlined scenario of digital identity, characterized by the large freedom to define the subject that could therefore, in this key, also be considered free of the dissemination of their data, even their personal data, for economic purposes. In this sense, two recent cases on the Italian legal seems to address precisely this issue. The first being a digital platform that corresponds money in exchange for the data of users, even if anonymized, peacefully declaring the economic nature of this, and following a request for clarification from the Italian Privacy Authority to the European one. The second one is a decision made by the Rome Court about an administrative sanction against Facebook, thanks to the fact that the platform did not make it clear its onerosity. The first one is a statement by the Italian Privacy Authority of 1st August 2019, and the second one is the pronounce of the Rome Administrative Court 261 of 2020. Of course, in this debate, there are many innovations that must be taken into account, starting with the recent directive of the European Union 717 of the 2019. The solution, which in this context has been found by the European legislator, once again reaffirms the importance of the principle of effectiveness in the field of protection of the individual in the digital context. In fact, the directive, the above-mentioned directive, has brought, well, in my opinion, a very interesting solution, according to the fact that it does not take any position above these two theses. Adopting a practical criterion, recognize that in order to use a digital services, any user must have the same protection as a consumer. If in fact digital identity can also be discussed from the point of view of the relationship with the social network, it seems at least appropriate that the conscious choice of the subject is possible, which, in the wake of the well-known criterion of correctness, must be intertwined with the duty to informed by the strong part of the report, typically the holder of the digital platform, according to the theory of legibility. On the other hand, it would be difficult to find different solutions worthy of acceptance. Completely denying the possibility of the subject to dispose his data would be in open contrast with the dynamic of the digital identity. In the same way, it would be the opposite solution to reject. Leaving the individual completely at the mercy of the web giants and the digital platforms managed by them seems to be poorly reconciled with the need for protection that the law recognizes to the weak subject, in particular in his capacity not only as a user but also as a consumer. The solution adopted by Directive 770, therefore, seems difficult to criticize with a view to a necessary balance of interests. In the reality of the network, so legal relationship seems too fragmented, and disproportion between subject to marked, so that the protection of weak persons can be left to the mere protection of private enforcement. One of the advantages of recognizing the same protection to users than the consumer's protection is this, at least in the Italian perspective. In stating that the protection of users is the same as that of consumers in the strict sense of term, allow other instruments of intervention available under the law. That is the protection of antitrust for unfair commercial practices. All right. So after this panoramic according to digital identity and the contractual agreement from users and digital platforms, in particular social networks, I found of interest to talk to you about a very practical example that was brought by the sentence of the Bologna Court of the 10th March of this year. It's a very recent case. I found it very interesting, according to the fact that, at least for what I know, it's the first case that ever happened in Italy, and I'm not aware of any other similar cases in the European Union. It's an example of social profile shutdowns. Shutdown. So I'm going to do a very briefly examine of the pronunciation, then I'll try to close my intervention as quickly as possible. I'm sorry. So this statement is basically this. The court says that Facebook is not only an opportunity for entertainment, but also a place for people for projection of their identity, of weaving of personal relationships, of expression and communication of their thought. And then the deletion of one's profile without any motivation, like in the case that I brought to you today, by the company must be compensated. In order to do that, well, the case is very simple. There was a common user who has his own profile, his own consumer profile, and also two pages that were linked to it. It was simply well, his own profile was a user profile like anyone else, and the two pages close to his profile were pages of history interests. Out of the blue, the profile and pages just over a year ago had been removed, without the company ever being given an explanation. On the contrary, on the part of Facebook, it was specified that it had destroyed all the documentation related to the contract, being therefore no longer in a position to verify the reasons for the removal and not even to restore the account. Well, I had to be more quickly and just go straight to the end of it. Well, long story short, well, briefly, the court recognized the presence of a non-material damage to the user, but according to the Italian law, a non-material damage in the Italian law system could only be recognized according to a very specific law that allow the judge to give a monetary statement, a monetary satisfaction. The court, in particular, found this rule directly in the Constitution, according to the principle of free expression, of free thoughts, and also in this Article 2 of the Italian Constitution, which is basically the solidarity. Well, I brought other pages, but I guess my time has gone, has basically less. All right. Well, just one quick consideration, or two. Well, I don't have time for the for any other topics that are not the further considerations that I brought to you today. Well, according to the fact that now a pronunciation has directly recognized the right for users to have a non-material damage recognized for his own profile shutdowns, I've asked myself which protection could be brought for the firms in their relationship with the social networks. The only possible solution that I find is the antitrust regulation. In particular, it is possible to imagine an obligation for the social networks to establish a contract, an agreement with firms, and if it is so, can we imagine a very specific agreement that could be designed before the agreement, according to the fact that that relationship is going to be between professionists and not a B2C contract. So I guess my time has really left, so thank you very much for your attention, and I guess that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Edoardo. Is there any question that you would like to ask? Any question? Yes?
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I actually, more than a question, was asking you if you could develop it a little bit. What is the grounding that you see for antitrust regulation applied here? And that's, let's say, if you could develop that.
According to the fact that we should imagine a limit to the antitrust regulation against social networks and platforms in general.
far as I understood, you talk about two different chains of contracts, right? And the let's say the relationship between the two firms and so, but then the application of antitrust regulation requires some type of either dominant position or some some practice that it's right. So what I was wondering is, do you see a capture? Do you see a hold up? Do you see what is the starting point that you see to trigger antitrust regulation to have the prima facie case there?
Yeah, sure. Well, clearly an oligopoly situation or even a monopoly situation, according to the fact that, especially with social networks, we only have just a few chances to develop a market. In particular, well, I'm not an economist, but demographic curves are very specific, determined in social networks. For example, people over 30 or 40 years are basically all in Facebook. The whole anographic curve between 15 or 25 are in Instagram, and the youngest are now in TikTok. I'm not an economist, I repeat once again, but in order to establish a publicity, in order to establish a social network position for a firm, you have, according to your target, choose one, or even the best option is have 2 pages in social networks. That's not a very fair competition situation. And the Italian antitrust already sanctioned the social networks many times, especially according to unfair trading practices. That is probably, at least in my opinion, the best chance that that we have against such strong firms. There's no other way, at least in my opinion.
I have the microphone, so I can. Now, maybe because I have my personal bias, because I am a public law scholar, I was wondering, wouldn't it be easier in the cases that those platforms are in a situation that can be responsible of the image of individuals, to establish some public regulation saying that in those cases, in those particular cases in which the image and the capacity of building an image and offering that image to others is effectively based on the capacity of being part of that network, so in those cases, maybe we can just establish some regulations for those networks, saying on those platforms, saying that in those cases they have to respect this, and this, and maybe establish a mandatory way of remedies if something happens.
Well, it could be possible, but as was said before, that's basically private enforcement. If we choose 1 or 2 particular cases, even if the authorities involved, even if authorities are involved, that's basically private enforcement. Because if we do not give to a public subject the strength, the economic strength to face some such well, strong subjects, we couldn't confront them, at least in my opinion. And also, even if one subject could win a case like this one, the economic sanction was 2,000 euros against Facebook. I guess that they are not going to change their contract, their terms and relations, their terms and regulations according to one first level court pronunciation for 2,000 euro. But the public enforcement strength, a public enforcement sanctions of millions or billions of euros, I guess I'm imagining, of course, could do that.